Hi, my name's Stephen. Today I am attempting to present some information that I've been studying over the last 2.5 years, about late 2021, in regards to some Bible timelines, when I believe the creation started through to the end of this age, which I believe is based on the idea behind creation, where the first 6 days represents 6,000 years of man's history, with the seventh day being the Sabbath in creation, represented by the millennial reign of Jesus Christ for 1,000 years. So this is the first time I have ever attempted to do a video. I felt it a need to put this out there, to share it with others. I have spent a lot of time, 2,000 to 3,000 hours working on this. It's come slowly. It hasn't been a piece of information that's just arrived. It's something that's taken a long time to put together. I believe that the Holy Spirit has led me to discover some of this information, and it sort of dawned on me that it's not really worth anything if I'm not sharing it with others and encouraging them in their search, either for Jesus or in their understanding of the Bible. So it's an attempt to share what I understand, what I know, and there's going to be mistakes, no doubt. And my goal is to learn the truth, to understand more about God and the Bible, and to just encourage others as much as I possibly can. I'm not qualified in any way. I'm not a pastor. I'm not a Bible scholar. I'm just someone who is interested in the Bible, interested in what God has to say to us, and that's where I'm coming from. Just in a brief introduction, so I'm from New Zealand. I live in Auckland in New Zealand, and excuse the accent. And I'm 51. My background as a Christian is all over the place. I was brought up in a church from about the age of 10, which was a little bit different from many churches. They kept the Sabbath on Saturday, so that was unique at the time. I didn't know none of my friends, sort of understood that, what I was doing. They were respectful of it, but it meant that there was no sport on Saturdays, there was no parties, there was no TV. It was strictly God and the Bible and church from sunset to sunset on Saturday. And that's how I spent that, 10 years of my life, from the age of 10 through to 20. They kept the Old Testament holidays, and again, very unique. We didn't keep Christmas or Easter as we know it. We kept Passover and unleavened bread and Feast of Tabernacles. And every year I would travel away with my mum and my 4 siblings to various places in New Zealand to keep the Feast of Tabernacles for 7 days. And my stepfather at the time didn't come with us. He wasn't a believer as such, but he was supportive of my mother, and so we did that. So about the age of 20, I left. I was, I guess, at that age where I was probably not understanding exactly what was going on, and my faith, my belief, I guess, in God never changed. I always believed in God and that Jesus Christ was our Saviour, but I guess I got a bit lost, and anyway, disappeared for a few years. Ended up being baptized, and then drifted away again for a long time. And it wasn't until about 3 years ago that I realized that perhaps it was time that I rebuilt my relationship with God, and I believe the Holy Spirit drew me back, and boy, has it been a ride ever since. But it's all because of God's grace and mercy that I'm sitting here today, able to put this information in front of people. So I'm very grateful for that. But it is a bit nerve-wracking to put forward information, knowing that there'll be people out there who will disagree, who will not just disagree, but be the vitriol that can come from that. So it is what it is, and I'm happy to put this out there to share it, not in a dogmatic way to say, look, I am right, everything I'm saying here is right. That's not the case. It's to present information that I've found to help as many people as possible to understand perhaps that there's another way of looking at the Bible timelines. So I wanted to start off at the beginning, which was, I think when I started studying this subject, one of the dates or events that I found out about quite quickly was this Revelation 12 sign on the 23rd of September in 2017. And I was quite intrigued by that. And I went away and read about that, and I'll just bring that up here. So it talks about, a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a garland of 12 stars. Then being with child, she cried out in labour and in pain to give birth. So those two verses, were quite intriguing, and from what I understood and saw, they were represented in the stars on the 23rd of September 2017. So let's have a look. So this is the 23rd of September 2017 in Stellarium. This is a program that I know many people are familiar with. I use it all the time. I've spent literally hundreds of hours looking at various conjunctions and alignments and reading books about the constellations. And my understanding of that is that God has put a picture of his plan for mankind in the stars, and that's described as signs that are, I think, there for us to look for. The book of Job talks about Orion and Pleiades, and I could go through those verses, but just to keep things as quick as possible, I believe that subjects such as cosmology, if you like, have been twisted by Satan in a way to become astrology, and the same thing with Bible numbers, another subject that I've studied quite intensely to understand, why is it that God uses certain numbers throughout the Bible over and over again, and what do they mean? And again, that's been twisted into numerology, and so that can put people off very quickly when they see this sort of thing and they look at it and they go, well, you're talking about satanic things, numerology and astrology, but that's not what this is. This is looking at God's plan, what God says, the numbers he uses, and what he shows us in the heavens. And interestingly enough, you look at this picture here of what is described in Revelation 12, 1 and 2. And you can see, the sun, Virgo, the woman is clothed in the sun. The moon is at her feet. Now, in terms of the 12 stars, the garland of 12 stars, well, there's 3 planets lying here, Venus, Mars, and Mercury. Leo has 9 major stars, which make up the 12. So here we see a sign that God presented in 2017. And I watch a lot of various people on YouTube, and I look at a lot of different watchmen who've talked about this, and that was approximately 7 years ago now, almost 7 years ago. Another fascinating number that God uses throughout the Bible, one of the most common. And so this got me interested in what was going on, and from there I started to try and put together timelines in terms of where we were using just historical evidence, Bible scripture, what was being shown in the stars, and any other information that I could put together to try and map together some timelines. And there's a lot of theories out there. There's a lot of information, and so I persevered. Anyway, one day I came across a date, a comment on someone's forum, and I don't recall where it was, and it was the Revelation 12 sign again. And going back to my timeline, I start here with this Revelation 12 sign, which I believe is the creation date, or the start of the creation. And that was on the 4th of August, 3915 BC, and I'll show you that in a minute. But the other major thing that I've done is I made a decision to look at these timelines from a prophetic year point of view. And what I mean by that is God uses a 360-day year when talking about prophecy. We see that in Daniel and in Revelation in a few instances. And in fact, the Noah flood story, if you look at all the timelines of the flood, that was actually a 360-day year as well. And of course, when you start mapping out some of these numbers, you see patterns that God uses throughout the Bible over and over again. And in this particular case, well, 6,000 years would be 2,160,000 days. So forgive me if you're not into maths and numbers, but there's going to be a little bit in maths and numbers in this presentation. And I'll try and make it as easy as possible to understand, and I'll get a little calculator out if I need to as well. But 6,000 years of 360 days is 2,160,000 days altogether. And I believe that particular timeline started on the 4th of August, 3915 BC. And I'll show that now. So in Stellarium, you have to go a year ahead or a year behind because of the way they work with year zero, between the end of the BCs and the start of the ADs or BCEs. And if I go to August, let's just go back a little bit, because what I want to show, actually we'll go back to let's go back to December of the previous year. So you can see Virgo here, the sun's all down here, there's planets all over the place. This is the ecliptic. This is the path that the planets, the sun and the moon travel on over a period of time. And if we move forward, you can see here the planets all moving forward. Jupiter's sort of stuck up there at the moment, moving backwards. We call that a retrograde. And you can see Venus retrograding there and then moving forward, etc. And the sun and the moon coming around, moving through the various constellations. So if we come forward a couple of months, you can see Jupiter's slowly moving down towards the womb of Virgo. And if we, we'll go back a little bit. You can see it had retrograded up. So for a period of 9 months, 40, which would be 40 weeks or 280 days, the Jupiter had retrograded and then started coming back down again towards the womb of Virgo, as pictured there. And then let's just go forward until we get to the 2nd of August, the 3rd of August, the 4th of August. Now I've got Stellarium set at 6 p.m. at night, which basically is sunset, and I'm on Jerusalem time, just for those who are interested. So what we have here on the 4th of August, 3915 BC, is the Revelation 12 sign again. But there's a difference. You've got Mercury, Venus, and Saturn now up here. Mars was there in 2017. It's not there in 3915 BC. But the moon is at her feet. She's clothed in the sun. Jupiter is exiting the womb, and you've got the three planets together with the 9 major stars of Leo, representing the 9 stars above her head. So here we have this other Revelation 12 sign that I believe is quite significant. And I think the fact that it was occurring in Virgo, which is the first sign of the constellation out of the 12 constellations, she is the first, would make some logical sense that it represents a creation, a point in time. Interestingly enough, and I just found this out this morning, is that if you go back 280 days from the 4th of August, 3915 BC, or 40 weeks, period of pregnancy, it actually lands on the 3rd day of the Feast of Tabernacles. And that date's going to come up again later on. But it is, I think, interesting that the 3rd day of the Feast of Tabernacles, which is on the Tishri 15, is the first day of the Feast of Tabernacles, which is the 7th month of the Hebrew year. And then the 17th of Tishri would be the 3rd day. So anyway, going forward 280 days, we land on the 4th of August, 3915 BC. And this would be the other Revelation 12 sign. And it's interesting, again, Jupiter has retrograded for 280 days and is now appearing to come out of the womb of Virgo. And goes back to Revelation 12:2. Then being with child, she cried out in labour and in pain to give birth. So that's sort of pictured there. So that for me was the starting point. But let's move on. So going back to the timeline, we have a period of 2,160,000 days, 6,000 years, that ended on the 20th of May 2000. And when I initially saw this, I'm like, well, what relevance does the 20th of May 2000 have? And if we go forward here on the timeline, there you have it there. And we'll get to that point at some stage later. But I want to show what was happening on the 20th of May 2000, because I think it was quite significant. So here we go, 20th of May. Look at all these planets lining up. So having spent literally hundreds of hours looking at the stellarium, events like this are incredibly rare. They do not happen where you have major conjunctions and alignments of planets all in one constellation. Incredibly rare. But what we have exactly 6,000 prophetic years later is all 5 of the major planets, doesn't include Uranus, Pluto, and Uranus was down here, Pluto's I can't even see at the moment. So you have all these planets in the constellation of Taurus. Now there's a lot of books about this stuff. Tauruses can be representative of the Christ coming back as our Redeemer in force, if you like. So I think that's quite interesting that at the end of that 6,000 year period, we see all of these planets happening to align on that exact day. I thought that was significant. It gets better. So the next thing that I started working on, and this may not be in chronological order, but I was curious to try and find out whether the birth and death of Jesus Christ was going to be relevant to any of this. And so I was working on that, and I didn't have any really preconceived ideas. I didn't really care whether he was born in 27 AD or 33 AD. Any year was fine. I just wanted to understand the truth and try and make sense of it all. And you'll see I came to a conclusion. But from that study, I started reading a lot of other material. I read the Book of Enoch, the Book of Jasher, the Book of Jubilees. I was doing timelines, all sorts of weird and wonderful timelines, and playing with numbers and dates to see what was making sense, what was logically, what worked, what fitted. And the Book of Jasher describes the birth of Abraham, and it talks about this collision of, or 4 stars coming into one. And I thought, well, that's interesting. And so, I started going through Stellarium, and I'd worked through all the genealogies of the Old Testament, Adam through to Abraham, and that added up to 1948 years. So I had some approximate idea when to sort of look to see if there was something in the stars that represented Abraham's birth. I mean, he's one of the most significant, figures in the Bible. So I started looking around, and sure enough, I found in 1953 BC, in an astrological event, which again was quite incredible. So what you can see down here in Aquarius, the bottom there, is all of these planets lining up, all 5 of them, all coming together. Apart from Saturn slightly out, but the other 4 are directly on top of each other, all in Aquarius on the 21st of February 1953 BC. So keep in mind, again, this is a year out because of the year 0. So that was interesting, because the information I'd read about Aquarius and what that represented is the pouring out, can be the pouring out of wrath of God or the pouring out of the Holy Spirit. And you can sort of see that represented by Aquarius. And I'm like, wow, okay, so we've got Abraham's birth right on a major cosmological event, and it's in Aquarius, and it's lining up with potentially a representation of the Holy Spirit being poured out. So I'm like, okay, let's go with that date. So on the timeline, we have here birth of Abraham on the 21st of February 1953 BC. So from that, I knew from the genealogies of the Bible that there was 1948 years, if you like, from Adam to Abraham. So looking at my trusty calculator here, 1948 years times by a 360-day year gives you 701, 280,000 days. So from there, I just worked backwards. And that led me to this date, the 21st of February, 3873 BC. Now, at the time, I'm like, okay, interesting. What does it all mean? But what I started looking at was, well, there's a time frame here. We've got a 6,000 year timeline starting in August 3915 BC, and we've got another 6,000 timeline starting on the 21st of February 3873 BC. Which one is correct? Because the theory is that at the end of the 6,000 years there will be a 7-year tribulation. At the very end of year 6,000, the tribulation would start 7 years before the end of that 6,000 year period. Jesus Christ would return, and then we would have 1,000 years with Jesus Christ ruling. And I'm like, okay, well, what have I got here? What is this? But what I found interesting was that there was a period of time here of 15,176 days. So you've got the 15,120, which is exactly 42 prophetic years. So 42 times 360 is 15120. And then there was this other 56-day period. And I'm like, okay, well, initially I had 15,176, and I sort of divided it by 360, and I got 42 years and 56 days. I'm like, okay, well, don't understand. What does that mean? But what I discovered was that the 56 days was actually the 29th of September. That was Tishri 1, which is the 7th month of the Hebrew calendar. And Tishri 1 is the Feast of Trumpets. And I thought, well, that's quite interesting. So I divided that out and said, okay, well, let's just take that 56 days, which I have seen over and over again in my timelines. It's 56-day periods, 28-day periods, 280-day periods. And the thing about the number 56, it's exactly 8 weeks. 28 days is exactly 4 weeks. 280 days is exactly 40 weeks. And of course, 56 goes into 285 times. So this number keeps appearing, and I'll go into that a bit later. So what we have here is a 56-day period from, let's say, the creation date to the Feast of Trumpets. Now, I have a theory on what that 56 days means. I'm going to cover that later because it's a theory only. Then we've got a 42-year period exactly to this Adam timeline starting. I suspect in that 42-year period, Adam was in the Garden of Eden, and that by the 21st of February in our timeline, that was when Adam and Eve were left or kicked out of the Garden of Eden, and his life timeline started. I believe and I suspect that before that he wasn't aging, and that he started aging from this date. So this timeline ends on the 7th of December 2041, which happens to be a full moon, and it happens to be the 9th month of the Jewish calendar, which is the month of Kislev, on the 15th. And what we see in the Jewish calendar is, so the days of unleavened bread, the first day of unleavened bread starts on the 15th of the first month of Nisan, and that's always a full moon. And then on the 7th month, on the 15th day of the 7th month, is the first day of the Feast of Tabernacles. So it appears to me that God uses the 15th. There's always going to be a full moon on the 15th, or there should be a full moon on the 15th of each month, and that is going to represent some special day to God. And of course, the numbers 1, 3, 7, I'll cover the numbers a bit later, are all very interesting numbers biblically. Actually, in fact, I'll show you one interesting little calculation which I read recently, which I hadn't picked up, but let's just look at the calculator. So 4 of the most significant Bible numbers you will find, and E.W. Bullinger talks about this in his book on biblical numbers, is the numbers 3, 7, 10, and 12. 3 represents divine perfection, 7 would be spiritual perfection, 10 is ordinal perfection, you see that in the 10 Commandments, and 12 is governmental perfection, which you see in the 12 tribes of Israel, the 12 disciples. There's a lot of 12s in the Bible. Interestingly enough, if you times together all of these numbers, 12 by 7 by 10 by 12, you have 2,520, which is exactly 7. Divide that by 360 days, you have exactly 7 years. So my conclusion is God uses numbers all the time in a very special way, and is, if we study it enough, we're going to see some patterns, and we're going to understand God and the Bible more effectively. Anyway, so we have these 2 timelines, 2 6,000-year timelines, one ending on the 20th of May 2000, another one ending on the 12th of December 2041, and which happens to be the 15th day of the 9th month. Again, 9 is a very special number to God, 3 times 3. We're going to see 3s a lot. Okay, interestingly enough, I believe there is a chiastic structure involved here as well. So there is a 15,176 day period at the beginning. There's the same thing at the other end. And if we go to the far end here, we will see this is the 7th of December 2041. And interestingly enough, if you come back 56 days, just like we came forward 56 days, you end up on the 12th of October 2041, which happens to be the 3rd day of the Feast of Tabernacles. So there are some interesting patterns, I think, here. But for this stage, we'll just leave that where it is and we'll head back to the beginning. So we've got the 2 6,000-year timelines starting. We then have the birth of Abraham exactly 1948 years later, 701,280 days later. So the next significant event is here when Adam leaves Haran and starts his sojourn. And he was age 75 when that happened, and that would be, based on this, on the Gregorian calendar against the Hebrew calendar, the 26th or the 27th day of the 2nd month of the Hebrew calendar, Iyar. So again, it's an interesting date. 27 is an interesting number, given that it's 3 times 3 times 3, which can represent God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit. And there were other events in the Bible that also occurred on Iyar 27. Okay, so with Iyar 27, there is a couple of dates I just wanted to cover quickly. One of them is in Genesis 8:14. Here we go. So it was in the 2nd month, Iyar, potentially, on the 27th day of the month, the earth was dried. So that was one of the key dates within the flood timeline. Then I also believe, and again I'll be covering this later, that Jesus Christ's ascension was on Iyar 27, which in 31 AD happened to be on the 7th of June in 31 AD, but we'll get to that. So we have Abraham leaving his home, and interestingly enough, another Bible number here is 75 is a very interesting number, and I've been thinking about this for a while, and funnily enough, I woke up at about 2 o'clock the other night, and it dawned on me what might be going on with this number. I'd already seen it a few times, but when you take 75 and you times it by 360 days, you get 27,000 days. Interestingly enough, 27 again is 3 times 3 times 3. In this case, 3 times 3 times 3 times 1,000. So again, we see the 3 and the triple 3 or 3 cubed appearing in a biblical pattern. I suspect there's a lot more 3s and 27s that I'm going to discover, but that's certainly one of them that got me very interested. There's another one that I'll show later on in terms of when Israel became a nation on the 14th of May 1948 through to when Israel turned 75 or 27,000 days old. Okay, so moving on, we have the Exodus. Now, I've seen a lot of theories on when the Exodus is, and look, this could be wrong, but based on the prophetic timeline, it would have been 430 years, as according to the book of Exodus, from the time that the children of Israel started their sojourn, which would have been Abraham, I believe, through to Nisan 15, the first day of unleavened bread, which I believe was the 14th of April, 1456 BC. This happens to be exactly 430 years apart, to the day, 154,800 days. So again, if we just look at the calculator, 430 times 360 is 154,800,000 days. So far, the timelines add up. Interestingly enough, in this year, in 1456 BC, and I'll just go to it and have a quick look to show you something that I had seen, which I thought was interesting. So this would have been the unleavened bread. See, what we see down here is you've got a Jupiter and Saturn very close to each other. Now, this isn't, I can't base this on scripture at all, but there is I guess, I've read that Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions can represent omens, good or bad. So it is interesting that if you go back a couple of months to February, you actually had both, you had Venus in here as well, all conjuncting on the 3rd of February. And then, of course, 2 months later, we have the Exodus. I wonder if that conjunction was somehow a sign that there was an omen coming, and, you know, it was a pretty bad omen for Egypt, a great omen for Israel as they left Egypt. So that was sort of interesting. I don't have scripture to back that up, but it's just a theory based on some other readings that I've done. Okay, moving on. So the next, and I'll just clarify, I have not put a lot of my work into this particular timeline. I have gone through virtually every person from Abraham all the way through all the major events and try and piece them together in a timeline. But for the sake of this video, I'm just sort of focusing on key dates, if you like, trying to get to the point. So the next major date I had was when Solomon begins building his temple. Now we know that was in the 4th year of his reign, according to 1 Kings, and that was 480 years after the children of Israel came out of Egypt. And the temple was built in the 2nd month. So we have again from the 14th of April, 1456 BC to this date, the 21st of April, 983 BC, which was the first day of the 2nd month, which is described in 1 Kings 6:18, I believe. Actually, that was 1 Kings 6:1. Let's have a quick look at that. So, and it came to pass in the 480th year after the children of Israel had come out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, which is the 2nd month, and he began to build the house of the Lord. So, calculating that out, that was the 21st of April, 983 BC, was the first or second day of the month of Ziv. And that was 172,770 days away from the 14th of April, 1456 BC, when I believe the Exodus occurred. Now, so it's not exactly 480 years, it's only 30 days short. So I wasn't too concerned about that. I thought that was pretty accurate. Now, the interesting thing about the temple, and again, it goes back to this number 27, is the temple didn't take 7 years to build. It took 7.5 years to build. And I thought, well, why wasn't it 7 years? I mean, God uses 7 throughout the Bible over and over again, but in this case, it was 7.5. It was also 7.5 years that King David reigned over Judah, not 7. So I'm like, okay, there's got to be something in this. So if you go and have a look again at this 7.5 years times by 360 days, we get 2,700 days. Again, we see the 27, the 3 times 3 times 3, which I think is representing God's stamp on something. So, and of course, the temple being, God's dwelling place. So I think that's why you sometimes see 7.5 year periods or 20 or 75 year periods, as opposed to 70 year periods or 7 year periods. I think the difference is it's God's mark on something. And you see that 27 or that the multiples of 3 times 3 or 3 times 3 times 3. So that's my idea about that at this point. Anyway, moving on, we then get to the next big event that goes into what I believe shows when Christ actually was baptized and when he was potentially born, but certainly when he died. And this is pretty controversial because there's a lot of theories out there. I've read a lot of them. And I would be happy to be proved wrong, but I guess at this point, this is what has come out through the timelines and the dates and the numbers, and it fits very, very well. So we know from history that Artaxerxes II, who was the king that gave Nehemiah the command to rebuild Jerusalem, and that links through to the Daniel 9 prophecy. So let's go and have a look at Daniel 9. Okay, and where do we want to go? Right. Okay, so verse 25. Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the command to restore and build Jerusalem. Now, that I believe was Artaxerxes II, who started his reign in 465 BC, and that is described in Nehemiah 2 verses 1. That was the command that allowed Nehemiah to go and rebuild Jerusalem. And then it says, until Messiah the Prince, there shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. Now, we know that a week is 7 years, so 7 plus 62 is 69, and 69 times 7 is 483 years. So the street shall be built again and the wall, even in troublesome times. And then it goes on to say, and after the 62 weeks, the Messiah shall be cut off, but not for himself. So that is representing Jesus Christ dying. And I believe that the prophecy of 483 years is from the command to rebuild Jerusalem to the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, which I believe is 31 AD, and I'll show you why. So let's also just have a look at what it says in Nehemiah, because there's a couple of key... Okay. And it came to pass in the month of Nisan, that's the first month of the Hebrew calendar, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, that's a key fact, the 20th year. And then it goes on with the story that Nehemiah gets permission to go and rebuild Jerusalem. So, going back to the timeline, that date there, so that period between the temple being built and Nehemiah's reign is probably not too relevant. I've just put it in there because all the other numbers are there. But it was around 525, almost 526 years. So I believe his reign was the 11th of July, or started his reign on the 11th of July, 465 BC. Now, a little bit of this I had to work backwards on, but I knew historically from Wikipedia and other historical facts that he started his reign approximately in that time. So I went away and I thought, is there anything in the stars? Was God showing us anything? So 465 BC, of course, I have to use 464. And then we go to July. And what we have going on here is quite interesting. So this is the 20th of July. Let's just go back a little bit further to the 10th and then the 11th. So what we see is Leo, which is the Lion of Judah, which also, Christ is known as the Lion of Judah. The star here, the major star in Leo, is called Regulus, which is considered the king's star. And Jupiter is known as the king planet. So what we have going on is Jupiter, the king planet, hitting Regulus, conjuncting with Regulus, the king's star, right on the 11th of July. And then Mercury, the messenger, that planet is considered the messenger, is also conjuncting there at that point. Also, interestingly enough, got Mars and Venus conjuncting in Gemini, but I won't go into details about that. But this here, when I looked at the time frames around the 11th of July, was like, well, that's interesting. You've got the king star conjuncting with the king planet, more or less when Artaxerxes II came into power. So I thought, okay, let's work with those numbers and see what comes out of it. So it says in Nehemiah 2:1 that in his 20th year he gave the command. So when did his 19th year end? And again, I did it in prophetic days. So 19 years prophetically was 6,840 days. You go forward from the 11th of July, 465 BC, 6,840 days, you end up on April the 3rd, 446 BC. Now this was Nisan 10. That's another interesting date because that's the day that the lamb is prepared for sacrifice for Passover. So that happened on the 3rd of April. Now, the next day, so this would be day 1 of the 20th year of his reign, was the 4th of April, right? 3rd of April, 4th of April, Nisan 11. And I believe this would fulfill Nehemiah 2:1. So one day later, we're into his 20th year. Now, let's just do some number crunching. The Daniel prophecy talks about 483 years from the command to rebuild Jerusalem to Messiah being cut off. So 483 times 360 is 173,880 days. Wow. As it turns out, from that date, the 4th of April, 446 BC, if you count forward exactly 173,880 days, you arrive at the 31st. Let's just move forward here. You arrive at the 25th of April, 31 AD, to the day. And that happens to be Nisan 14, 31 AD. Now, there's a lot of speculation, there's a lot of discussions, there's a lot of controversy over when Jesus Christ was crucified. But this pretty much proved to me that it had to be 31 AD. And I've believed that now for a couple of years. I've heard a lot of people talking about 30 AD. I hear a lot of people talking about 33. But this to me was very convincing. It would take quite a lot for me to be unconvinced, but that's the conclusion I came to. The fact that it landed right on Nisan 14, the Passover, on the 25th of April, 31 AD, was like, wow, that's incredible. So let's just come back a little bit, because that shows potentially what I believe is the crucifixion date in link with the Daniel 9 prophecy and the reign of Artaxerxes. But the birth of Jesus Christ is a little bit more interesting. And for a long, long time, I had the belief that he was probably born on the 11th of September 3 BC. And that was on, again, Tishri 1 on the Feast of Trumpets. It made a lot of sense. So I'm going to come back and we'll jump into Stellarium and we'll have a look at that date. So minus 2 BC on the, what have we got? September the 11th. Okay, so again, see we have Jupiter conjuncting with Regulus, the king star, the king planet, Leo, the Lion of Judah. You've got Venus and Mercury in Virgo, the sun, the moon at her feet. I mean, it's almost the Revelation 12 sign. I mean, if Venus and Mercury were a little bit higher, it would be the Revelation 12 sign. I'll add this now. I've gone through 6,000 years of Stellarium history looking for Revelation 12 signs. There are none, there's only two, where there's others, but not where Jupiter retrogrades for 9 months and comes out the womb of Virgo. That only happens twice, in 3915 BC and in 2017. The other Revelation 12 signs, Jupiter's not doing that. So slightly different. Anyway, so that's what's happening in 2 BC. So for a long time, this is 3 BC. For a long time, I thought this was Christ's birth date, but about 6 to 9 months ago, I'd say, I saw a video from Lee Brainard talking about potentially Shavuot or Jesus Christ being born around that period. And I thought, okay, well, that's interesting. Let's just look at that, because it is this date here, Feast of Trumpets, could actually be Jesus Christ's conception date, not the birth date. So I worked that back into the timelines, and this is what I came up with. Okay, so I've got Jesus Christ being conceived on the 11th of September 3 BC, which would be the Feast of Trumpets. Here we have it here. And here's another really interesting, sort of very unusual number. From Abraham's birth on the 21st of February 1953 BC to Christ's conception on the 11th of September 3 BC is exactly, to the day, 712,440 days. That's 1979 prophetic years. Now, when you're doing this number crunching, and believe me, I've done thousands of calculations, when you have a number that rounds exactly to a 360-day period, there's no extra days plus or minus anywhere, you sort of stop and look and go, wow, that's pretty interesting. So I think this is quite interesting. That was exactly that period of time, and it was that short, exactly 21 years from a 2,000-year period, which would be, like I've said here, 720,000 days. Now, I'm still not entirely sure why there's that gap, but I think it's of significance. Love to hear anybody's thoughts on why it might be 21 years. I've got some thoughts on the number 21 and the number 42 and how they link, but for now, it's just something that's sitting there. So what we then have is a human pregnancy period that usually lasts 40 weeks. What I've got here is a 280-day period or 40-week period from the 11th of September through to the 17th of June. And we know that Hebrew children, boys, were circumcised on the 8th day. And that's talked about in Leviticus 12 as well. And so the theory here is that Jesus was actually born on the 9th of June, which would have been the 3rd month of the Hebrew calendar, the month of Sivan, on the 7th day, and then circumcised on the 8th day, which would be Sivan 15, which again is the 15th day of the 3rd month. 15 days you have full moons. I have a theory, and I'm not the only one, but that the 15th day of Sivan is actually the true Pentecost, which would line up with Jesus Christ being born on Pentecost, on Shavuot, which is the Hebrew name for it. So I think there's there's some logic in that. I could be wrong, but it would make a lot of sense. So at this point, I have concluded that Jesus was probably conceived on the Feast of Trumpets, born on Shavuot, Pentecost. So moving forward, one other very interesting date, I guess, around him being, I guess, born on the 9th of June is if you count forward exactly 12 years. So again, 12 times 360 days is, what do we get? 4,320 days, which I've put in here. So that's 12 prophetic years. From the birth on the 9th of June would land you on the 7th of April, 11 AD. Now, we know from the book of Luke, chapter 2, 41 and 42, that is when Jesus was found in the temple, learning, and he was certainly in Jerusalem on his 12th birthday, according to Luke 2, 41 to 42. And it just happens to turn out that exactly 12 years from his birth happened to be Nisan 15, the first day of unleavened bread, on that day. Now, I think that's quite an incredible coincidence. I suspect it gives some weight. I believe it gives weight to the fact that he was probably born on the 9th of June. So we come forward to the 7th of April. He turns 12. Then the next key date is when does he turn 30? Because we know that it says in not all the Gospels, but certainly at least 2 or 3 of them, that he was around 30 when he was baptized and his ministry started. So when did he actually turn 30 based on this timeline? Well, that happened to be 30 times 360 days, 10,800 days after his birth, which would be the 1st of January, 29 AD. Now, this happened, again, I told you you're going to keep seeing 27s and 3s. This happened to be Kislev 27, right? And this is the 3rd day of Hanukkah. So, again, a very interesting coincidence that we see Jesus turning 30 on that particular day. Now, the next big theory here is, when did Jesus actually get baptized? And I've made a little mistake in here. But it is based on another really interesting, one of the interesting timelines down here. So I'm going to go back again. Okay, if we count exactly 4,000 years, or 1,440,000 days from the Revelation 12 sign on this date, on the 4th of August, 3915 BC, we end up on the 4th of February, 29 AD. Now, this is an interesting number. We know about the 144,000 in Revelation. We know that 12 times 12 is 144. There's some links to the tabernacle, which I'll probably end up talking about in another video if I ever do another one. And I think that number is quite significant. But it is exactly 4,000 years to the day, in prophetic years, to the 4th of February, 29 AD. And let's just go and have a look at 29 AD. So here we go. The 4th of February. Here we can see Aquarius again. This was the same constellation where the planets were all lined up for Abraham's birth. And we see on the 4th, we see Venus in there, which can represent Jesus Christ. We know that Venus is described in Revelation as the morning star. Venus, of course, is the morning star and the evening star. We have Jupiter in here as well, right on this, just here. And you have the sun, which can represent God the Father, right over the Aquarius, if you like, pouring out the Holy Spirit. So there is potentially here, I think, a picture of Jesus' baptism on this date. I think logically it could work. The fact that it's exactly 4,000 years, or 1.44 million days away, is very, very interesting. So how old was Jesus then when he was baptized? Well, he would have been 30 and 33 days. Again, 33 is a very interesting number. 3 times 11, we see that, again, another multiple of 3. But the fact that Jesus was 30 years old and 33 days, and from the Revelation 12 sign, it's exactly 4,000 years to this day, plus we see what's happening in the constellations, I suspect that Jesus could well have been baptized on the 4th of February 29 AD. Now, this then leads through to, well, how long was Christ's ministry? From the from the Daniel 9 prophecy and the reign of Artaxerxes and the 483 years, we get to the 25th of April 31 AD. So that would mean from his baptism, which was only a couple of months away from Passover, which is, the book of John describes all the feasts that Jesus kept. And of course, the first Passover, I think, is described in John 4. I need to double check that. But anyway, point being that we've now got a period of time between his baptism and his crucifixion. Well, this sort of blew me away. It turned out that it was exactly 810 days. And I'm like, well, what relevance is 810? I couldn't work it out initially. But then I thought, okay, well, how many months is that? Well, it's 27 months. Again, we see 27 again. 3 times 3 times 3. So could it be that Christ's ministry was actually 2 years and 90 days, which would be 810 days, or 27 months? It does fit the description of the feasts that Jesus kept in the book of John. There is one contentious date in the book of John, and this is why a lot of people believe that Jesus Christ's ministry was 3.5 years long. And I would have thought that as well, but I guess I've come to the conclusion that perhaps his ministry wasn't 3.5 years, it was actually 27 months. I might just cover that off quickly. Okay, I'm gonna jump over to one of my working sheets, so excuse the mess. Some of this information isn't 100% accurate because I've changed some things. But what is correct is that the first Passover is described in John 2:13. We know that's a Passover, it's in black and white. The next event was in John 5:1. And let's just jump across and have a look at what John 5:1 actually says. Typed it in. Okay, after this, there was a feast of the Jews. So John doesn't specify which one it is. It doesn't say Passover. Going back to the next one mentioned is John 5:1. That is specifically mentioned as Feast of Tabernacles. John 6:4 is Passover again. John 7:2 is Feast of Tabernacles again. John 10:22 is Hanukkah, the Feast of Dedication. And then we know the final one was the last Passover that Jesus died at. So the big question mark for me, and I've read various opinions about this, was John 5:1 a Passover, which would make his ministry more than 3 years? Or was it in fact another festival? Now I suspect, based on what I've discovered, that it probably wasn't a Passover. It could have been Shavuot, most likely Shavuot or Pentecost. The reason I say that is John specifically mentions Passover 2-3 times, and he specifically mentions Feast of Tabernacles. Why not mention or say Passover or Tabernacles when it comes to John 5:1? Was he referring to another feast? Now we know that the Hebrews had to visit Jerusalem 3 times a year, so it could well have been Pentecost or Shavuot. So my conclusion was that that second period, that second holiday that Jesus attended was actually Shavuot, which would fit this timeline, allowing for his ministry to only be 27 months long, not 3.5 years. So take that as you will, but that's the conclusion I'd come to. Anyway, moving down, there's another sort of very interesting timeline around. I'll cover this one next. So from Jesus' death to the destruction of the temple, we know that was in 70 AD. So the period of time there we've got is this number of days, 14,366 days from the crucifixion to this date I've got is the 24th of August in 70 AD. Now, I looked at, Wikipedia, for example, says the destruction of the temple was the 30th of August. So I'm 6 days out, but that's fine. What this would suggest on a prophetic timeline, it was 39 years, 362 days, 326 days. I'm 34 days short of a 40-year prophetic period, which again is 14,400 days. So that this is interesting, but more interestingly is the period here. So if I go back to the start of this timeline at the bottom, the Adam timeline, which started on the 21st of February 3873 BC, if you count forward exactly 4,000 prophetic years, 1,440,000 days, you get the 24th of August, 70 AD. So what are the chances that the first 6,000 timeline lands you on a potential baptism date of Jesus Christ, and the other 6,000 timeline lands you on the year within days of which the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed? I think that's pretty incredible. So I'll just put that there for now and go back to what happens after Jesus' death. So we know, so many theories on this, but the conclusion that I'd come to was that the 25th of, need to go back a little bit, the 25th of April was a Wednesday. He was in the tomb Wednesday night, Thursday night, Friday night. There's your 3 nights. So that means he was in the tomb Thursday day, Friday day, and Saturday day. That's your 72 hours, your 3 days and 3 nights. That would mean he had to be resurrected at sunset on the Sabbath, at the end of the Sabbath, basically. That would be the 72 hours. So by the time Mary and Peter and John arrived at the tomb the following day, which we know was the first day of the week, that was Sunday, and was the 4th day of unleavened bread, he'd already risen. So we can assume then from daybreak, that was day 1. So Sunday morning, the 29th of April, 31 AD was his first day. But he was resurrected at the end of the 3rd day of unleavened bread. So moving forward, we then have this period of time where he sees the disciples at the evening, on the evening of Sunday, and then he disappears for 8 days, and it says in John 20:26, I think it is. Here it is, John 20:26, that Jesus departs for 8 days and sees Thomas. But it says in the verse specifically after 8 days. So that ends up being May the 7th, 31 AD. Now, I believe that the reason Jesus was away for 8 days is in line with the Leviticus 12 description of what happens when a woman gives birth to a boy. And I'm just going to cover that. I think this is something I've sort of come to terms with in the last week. Let's just find it. Leviticus 12 verses 1. Okay, so verse 2, speak to the children of Israel, saying, if a woman has conceived and born a male child, then she shall be unclean 7 days. Now, Jesus was away from the disciples for 8 days. And then, as in the days of other customary impurities, she shall be unclean. Now, this would infer to me that if the woman is unclean, that the child is with her. So the child is maybe not necessarily unclean, but certainly, well, it would sort of indicate to me that the baby's probably unclean as well. I could be wrong on that, but that's that would be my logical conclusion from that. And then on the 8th day, the flesh of his foreskin shall be circumcised. So this is again the 8th day. This goes right back to Abraham and the covenant with Abraham and God about circumcision and why that happened on the 8th day. And it is interesting that it happens on the 8th day. Why not the 4th? Why not the 5th? Why not the 10th? It's the 8th. Okay, so a full 7 days have passed, which is, the number of divine or spiritual perfection. And then the 8th day, the child is circumcised. And then she shall continue in the blood of her purification 33 days. So she shall not touch any hallowed thing, nor come into the sanctuary until the days of her purification are fulfilled. Now, and then it goes on to talk about a female child, and that's double. But this would mean that the period of time that a woman is unclean, if you like, is 40 days. 7 plus 33, the 8th day is circumcision. Now, I find that very interesting because Jesus was away 7 days, and then the 8th day, and then another 33 days, and he ascended on day 40, according to Acts, where it talks about him being with the disciples for 40 days. So the conclusion that I'd come to was that I think his disappearance for 8 days was actually in line with this ritual after childbirth. And so that would mean that he was going through some, purification process, possibly, where he was waiting 7 days, and then the 8th day, so here's my theory. The 8th day is when he presented himself to the Father as the first fruit. Now, a lot of people think it's right after he was resurrected. I think it could be the 8th day. And that explains why he was away 8 days, 7 days. Then on the 8th, he presents himself to the Father. Now, in 31 AD, the timeline and the dates that align with this become a little bit more interesting. The 7th day was the Saturday, the Sabbath, and this is the Sabbath after unleavened bread. So there are a number of different ways people count Pentecost, and most people count it from the Sabbath within the week of unleavened bread. You've got some people that count it from the first day of unleavened bread because it's a holy Sabbath, it's a high Sabbath. Some people count it from the 7th day because it's a high Sabbath. Some count it from the Saturday in the middle. Another group of people have said it's from the Sabbath after the unleavened bread is finished. Now, I don't think any of those contradict with Leviticus 23, but what this is showing is that potentially the Sabbath after unleavened bread had finished was day 7 that Jesus was away. That would mean if you were counting Shavuot, or the Feast of Weeks, from the following day, from Leviticus 23, as mentioned in Leviticus 23, the Feast of First Fruits would be that Sunday. That would be the 8th day. So if I go and jump into Leviticus 23, where are we? Okay, Feast of First Fruits. So we've got unleavened bread here. It talks about Passover. And this is where all the confusion is. He shall wave the sheaf before the Lord to be accepted on your behalf on the day after the Sabbath. The priest shall wave it. And look, I know there's so much controversy over this. I suspect that it's a Sabbath after unleavened bread. It's the first Sabbath after unleavened bread. Now, as it works out, that, as I say, that would mean that the Sabbath was on the 7th day. The Sunday would be the Feast of First Fruits, the day after the Sabbath. That was the 8th day. Then Jesus appears to them after 8 days, according to John 20:26, and sees Thomas. 40 days later from his resurrection is June the 7th, 31 AD. Now that happens to be IAS 27. So again, you see the 3 times 3 times 3. And that would therefore mean 17 days later, Pentecost would have occurred. So I've got this written here. So the 50-day count from the Feast of First Fruits, if it was on the 7th of May, would end up on the 24th of June, 31 AD, and that happened to be Sivan 15, which would be, I think I've got an error in here, but anyway, okay, sorry, I just had a typo in there. So, so Pentecost would be 50 days after the 7th of May, which would land you on June the 24th, which was Sivan 15. Again, the 15th month of the third month, the 15th day of the third month. Again, God loves the numbers 1, 3, and 7. It would make sense that Pentecost would fall on the 15th day with a full moon on the third month. We've seen 3 appear over and over again. It just it makes logical sense, and it in fact fits in with the timeline that I'm presenting here. So, and just the other thing about number 17, the fact that it's 17 days from Christ's ascension to Pentecost, is 17 is a very interesting number. And if you go to John 21:11, you see that sort of prophecy, I guess you'd call it, on the 153 fish. Well, that's 17 times 9 is 153. Again, we see 9, 3 times 3. You see 17. I won't go into the specifics about 17, but it's, well, I've noted there that it's a combination of 7 and 10, and there's some meaning behind that. I've already talked about 7 and 10 previously. So again, just some interesting numbers to contemplate. This would be quite controversial, I believe, but that's the conclusion I'd come to. All right, so moving on. So that sort of covers off where we're up to in the timeline to the destruction of the temple and Christ's ascension and Pentecost in 31 AD. Next we have the next major event is pretty much 1905 years later, which was when Israel became a nation. So that was this many days, 685,825 days after the destruction of the temple, and this is the 14th of May 1948. Now, here we go. So, the 6,000 year timeline from the Revelation 12 sign ends on the 20th of May 2000. I've shown you that in Stellarium. It's very significant. It's very unusual what's going on in the stars. It also happens to be exactly 19,000 days to the day from when Israel became a nation again. Again, it's a perfectly round number. To see numbers like this when you're doing these sorts of date calculations is incredibly unusual. So I think it's significant. And it's 52 years. 52 years is an interesting number, or 52. 26 can represent God. 26 times 2 is 52. So there could be something in that. So it's 52.777 forever years, but 0.77, I'll make this easier. If you take 19,000 days and you divide by 360, you get 52.777 reoccurring. Now, that can be also 280 days, which is 40 weeks, gestation period of a woman, etc. Divide that by 360, you get 0.7777. So what this is saying is that it was exactly 52 years and 280 days from Israel becoming a nation to the 20th of May 2000 that happens to line up perfectly with the end of the Revelation 12 6,000 year timeline. I think that's quite incredible. Then what we have is this down the bottom here is another 8,000 year period, exactly 8,000 days to this date here, the 15th of April 2022. Now the 15th of April 2022 just happens to be Passover. So that would mean Israel, 19,000 plus 8,000 is 27,000. We see 27 again, 75 years, 3 times 3 times 3. Israel turned 75 prophetically on Passover, the 15th of April, 2022. I think that's of significance. Now, the other thing going on, which I haven't talked about yet, was This 42-year period, or 15,120-day period between the two 6,000-year timelines. And 42 is a very interesting number. One, we know it's the period of months that the Antichrist will reign. 42 months is, 1,260 days. 42 months is 1,260 days. 42 years is interesting as well. And I'll just get the trusty calculator. So 15,120 days, you divide that, oops, that's wrong. Okay, divide that by 12. Oh, what's this one here? My calculator's not doing what it should do. Here we go. Okay, 15,120 days divided by 12 happens to be 1,260 days, which is, divided by 360, 3.5 years. So 42 years is made up of 12 periods of 3.5 years, or six periods of 7 years. So 2,520 days times by 6 is also 42 years. But what I propose is that the 42 years is actually broken up into 3.5 year periods. And what I've mapped out here is the 12 periods of time from the 20th of May through to the end of the other 6,000 timeline, the Adamic, if you like, 6,000 year timeline. So you can see here each of the periods going from the first one finishes on the 1st of November, the second one on the 14th of April 2007, etc., etc. So all this time has passed, and there may be some significance in those dates. I haven't studied them in a whole lot of detail, but there could be some clues in there. But the one that gets interesting is the latest one. So period 6 ended on the 30th of January 2021, and that would mean we're now in the 7th period out of 12. 7, spiritual perfection, perfect number of God. So I take note when I see number 7. Now, what's happened in this period, number 7? So the first thing is we had Israel turning 75 here, and that was from the 30th of January 2021 to the 15th April was 440 days, 1 year and 80 days. And then we have another interesting date. From Passover 2022 until the Israel attack from Hamas on the 7th of October 2023 was exactly 540 days, 1.5 years to the day. And that happened to be on the last great day, which was the 8th day, again, 8th of the Feast of Tabernacles. So there's some interesting numbers in here going on. The most interesting thing, I think, is the fact that the 1,260 day, the 7th period of 1,260 days finishes on the 13th of July 2024 this year. Now, I suspect that it could be possibly the start of the tribulation. Possibly. It would make logical sense, but I could be wrong. What is the other interesting thing, going back to the 280 days, is from the 7th of October, when Israel was attacked, through to the 13th of July, to the end of the 7th period, is exactly 280 days, or 40 weeks again, the period of probation or trial or pregnancy. So, we hear about birth pangs in the Bible and that sort of terminology, but it is a period of, typically known as a period of probation or trial. We see that throughout the Bible. The Israelites wandered through the desert for 40 years. Moses is up on the Mount Sinai for 40 days. Jesus is in the wilderness for 40 days and 40 nights. We see 40 over and over again. So this 280-day period, 40 weeks, I think is quite significant. I know people have been talking about the solar eclipse earlier, and the fact that it's exactly 40 days to the 18th of May. That's another day that people are looking at, 18th of May 2024. But based on the numbers I'm seeing here, the 13th of July certainly looks interesting. So then we get into the sort of the tribulation period. So this would mean if the tribulation started on the 13th of July this year, that would be at the end of the 7th period. I think that's interesting. And then we're into the start of the 8th period. Now, that would be a 1260-day period, as we know, and that would end on the 25th of December, 2027. Now, there's a whole lot of really interesting things about the 25th of December. It's Christmas for most Western civilizations. And a lot of Christians celebrate the 25th of December as Christ's birth, though I don't believe that's got anything to do with Christ's birth. However, it also happens to be Kislev 25 that particular year. So the way the Gregorian calendar matches up with the Hebrew calendar is all over the place. The calendars are a complete mess, but they match up in that year, on that day. You have 25th of Kislev, which is the start of Hanukkah, and the 25th of December, which is Christmas, on 25th of December 2027, exactly 1260 days after the 13th of July. And that would be, so if I'm calculating up the total number of days of 1260 day periods, period 8 happens to be, let's get into there. So 8 times 1260 days equals 10,080 days. So it's day 10,080 out of 15,120 days. So if I divided that by 360, that would be year 28. So it's the 28th year out of 42 years. Now here's another interesting little thing I picked up, and I thought, I don't know if there's anything in this, but if I divide that by the number of days in the 42 years, I get 66666. I'm like, and the reason I thought that was interesting is that this date, being the midpoint of the tribulation, would represent the abomination of desolation as described in Daniel. And the fact that it's day 10,080 out of 15,120 and as a fraction is 666, I thought was sort of ironic. But there is some history behind this which makes it more interesting. There was a king called Antiochus Epiphanes who desecrates the temple in Jerusalem on Kislev 25 in 168 BC. Now, that happened to be December the 26th that year. But I think there's potential that could this be a type of copycat event? Could Satan be using the same thing and repeating it on the same day? Well, possibly. It certainly fits history, and it certainly fits the timeline that we've got here. So there's some other things I've mentioned in there, but let's just move on. So potential date is abomination of desolation. Then another 1260 days, so that would come to the end of the 7-year period of 2,520 days. You have the end of the 9th period. And I did the same calculation again. So if you take 9 periods of 1,260 days, which is 11,340, and you divide that into the 15,120, you get 0.75. Well, 0.75, 75 keeps coming up again and again. So we had Abraham being 75. I showed the link to 3 and 3 times 3 times 3. There's just some very interesting numbers that appear with this timeline. The other very interesting thing that I found was June the 7th, 2031 is exactly 2000 Gregorian years. So this isn't prophetic years now. This is the only time I've looked at Gregorian years, the 365.25 solar year in my timelines. But it stood out like a sore thumb, so of course I'm going to consider it. But it's exactly 2,000 years from when Jesus ascended. if I go back to, where are we? I have to come down a wee bit. So the date that I believe Jesus ascended 40 days later was June the 7th, 31 AD. And now we have the ninth period of 1260 days also landing on the 7th of June. I mean, you can sort of maybe understand why I was sort of blown away with some of these coincidences. So the thing that went through my head was, wow, wouldn't that be fascinating if Christ ascended on the 7th of June 31 AD and descends exactly 2,000 years later on June the 7th, 2031. It was a bit of a wow moment for me. Now, I've also listed down here what the 1290 day period date would be, which is the 7th of July, and the 1335 day period, all mentioned in Daniel 12. And some of those dates, again, interesting, and I suspect have meaning. Now, they're not necessarily landing on, let's say, the holy days mentioned in the Bible. They're not landing on the Feast of Trumpets. They're not landing on the Feast of Tabernacles necessarily. I'm not entirely sure that matters. I know a lot of people would disagree with that, and that's fine. I'm not happy to be convinced otherwise, but I don't know if it's relevant. I think potentially those dates, the Feast of Trumpets, the Feast of Tabernacles, they will be fulfilled in other ways. So again, it's a bit of a work in progress. I'm not convinced on everything. This is what the timeline's showing me at this point. So the other theory that I've got, and this is just a theory, is there is another really interesting date that came up through Stellarium in 2040. And it's on the Feast of Trumpets, funnily enough, and that is on the 8th of September. And what you can see here is another major conjunction, very rare conjunction of planets on the 8th of September 2040, which is in the constellation of Virgo. Now, I've read the Bible a few times. I've always wondered about this Ezekiel 40 temple, and I just wonder if the Feast of Trumpets 2040 could possibly be that's when that temple is completed. There's certainly time for it to occur. Now, Solomon's temple, we know, was built in 2,700 days, 7.5 years. Between June the 7th, 2031 and the 8th of September 2040, there's a good period of time, and there's 9 years. There could be a couple of years of sorting the world out. Then you could have that 2,700 day period to build the temple. Now, if I'm right, which again could be completely off on this, 7.5 years prior to that date is what have we got here? The 17th of April, 2033. That's right, smack in the middle of it's the fourth day of unleavened bread. Now, that was the day Jesus Christ was resurrected. So there is an interesting pattern there, and I wonder if it does have some significance. So anyway, it's just something I threw in here. It may be irrelevant, but it's just a thought. From there, from the 8th of September 2040 to the end of so if we go back up here to the various periods, so the ninth period out of the 12 of 1260 days ended on the 7th of June. The 10th period ends on the 18th of November. The 11th period ends on the 1st of May 2038. And then the 12th period ends on the 12th of October 2041, which is the third day of the Feast of Tabernacles. I think that's interesting. Then you have a 56-day gap, like we did at the beginning, and you end up on the 7th of December 2041, which is Kislev 15, the full moon. Now, from this date, this Feast of Trumpets date on the 8th of September 2040 is exactly 400 days, which can represent a divinely perfect period. And that can be shown in Genesis 15:13. Apparently the 22nd letter of the Hebrew alphabet is Tav, represented by 400 in Gematria. So there could be a link there. But it is interesting that it's exactly 400 days from that very significant cosmological event on the Feast of Trumpets 2040 through to the very, well, almost the very end of the Adam 6,000 year period. Again, you've got that last 56 days to go. So that concludes the timeline. That's all I've put together so far, showing what I believe to be some pretty interesting numbers and dates with some very interesting links and coincidences. God certainly has put numbers in the Bible for a reason. I believe that there are signs in the stars that you can map against these various events that give some weight to each of them. There's a lot that I've left out. I mean, I'm already up to an hour and 30 minutes now. It's way longer than I intended. But this stuff is quite complicated. There's a lot of dates, a lot of numbers, and I'm trying to consolidate and summarize, sort of 2,500 to 3,000 hours worth of study. This did not come to me in one go. It came to me, I believe, through the Holy Spirit over that period of time, and I just kept studying, I kept listening to other people, I kept reading, and slowly but surely this has come together and been pieced together over time. And I just came to the conclusion finally that it's all well knowing this stuff and studying it, but if I'm not sharing it with others, what's the point? So I felt on my heart that I needed to get this out there, and I'm not really too worried what people think. If it makes sense to people, fantastic, and I hope it gives you maybe some ideas with your own studies and your own thoughts around what's going on in the world and whether we are at the end of the 6,000 period. Again, I'm not entirely sure when the 1,000-year millennial period actually would start. I'm not entirely sure when the rapture would start or would occur. Now, my theory is that it might occur any time between today, the 2nd of May, and between the 13th of July. But I could be completely wrong. I mean, parts of this timeline could be off, but it seems to fit together very well. The numbers don't really lie. The events, either biblically or through the stars, don't really lie. God uses numbers in such a way to make it logical. So I think a lot of it makes sense. But yeah, would love to hear feedback. And if there's glaring errors, then you know what, fine, because I just want to come to the truth of what God is trying to show us. I think it's really important to stay open-minded to a point. I mean, you can't be so open-minded you change your mind every 5 seconds. And there's certain things in here that, I mean, I just can't really waver on too much. I mean, there's some significant dates in here that really make so much sense that it would be hard to for me to give up those possibilities. But when it comes to the end of this timeline, I think there could be a lot of different options. I mean, I suspect the tribulation will start in 2024. I suspect, given the state of the world at the moment, it's likely. And to date, I haven't found any other periods of time within that 42-year period between May the 20th and 2000 and the 7th of December 2041 that would fit so perfectly as the 13th of July through to the 25th of December through to the 7th of June 2031. And I haven't covered off all the other alignments of planets and what's going on from a stellarium point of view. But anyway, I'm going to post this, and I will wait for some feedback and, either amend things or maybe have to produce some more videos and explain some other things.